Hey everyone. My name is Shakti Das. Most people just call me Shaq. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. Today I'm going to be giving a presentation on my level design fundamentals. These are not the fundamentals about level design, but fundamentals I think folks should know based on my experience in the industry over the last 3 years. First, an introduction. I started level design as a student over at the University of Utah back in 2019, where I helped publish various indie games with some friends and other students and worked on some portfolio pieces. Um, by my senior year, said portfolio pieces kind of blew up on Twitter and got me noticed, and by that point, I had applied to numerous jobs and eventually got one over at Hi-Res. My first industry job was as an associate level designer over on Paladins Champions of the Realm at Hi-Res. This is an asymmetrical multiplayer 5v5 shooter. Think Overwatch, but with a hell of a lot more ability customization. Over there, I handled collision fixes, map reworks, which were remakes of older maps with new art and some new layouts. I helped work on Dawnforge, which was the game's first new siege map in years. Siege is the integral mode of the game where you push one card to the other side of the map. And I also helped work on LTMs, which were limited time modes for the game, just foundational gameplay that had slight variance to it, like a new custom map or 150% more health and stuff like that. So pretty fun experience. 2023, I left Hi-Res and transitioned over to Sanzaru Games, which is a VR studio under Meta. Over there, I helped work on Asgard's Wrath 2, which is an entirely different game compared to Paladins. Open world VR RPG with a distinct focus on hubs, which are these big overworlds with a lot of side activities around. Think Elden Ring. Basically VR Elden Ring with a lot of exceptions. In terms of hubs, I tackled a lot of bug fixes. I helped work on one of the game's main hubs, Muspelheim. I was basically handed the main paths of it complete and helped develop all the side content and the quests around it to make sure it was playable from start to finish. Alongside the main hub component of the game, there's also a roguelike mode that's entirely separate from it called Uncharted Rifts. There, I helped patch up some bugs and worked on the Duat biome, which is a new biome of the mode that was released post-launch. I'll talk a bit more about the mode later. I helped integrate collectibles into the game and polish them, such as secret chests and some items the player could destroy if they're in certain locations in the hub. And I also helped work on Cosmic Event Missions, which is the game's live service aspect. I just realized I didn't turn my camera on, so I'm going to do that. There we go. Cool. So I'm going to offer you a definition of level design. This is not the definition, but my definition for it based on my experience over the last 3 years. Level design is building a space for the player to navigate using modular tools and primitives while taking mechanics, aesthetics, and pacing into account, alongside encouraging collaboration with relevant developers. It's those 3 words that are bolded I'd like us to focus on. First, let's talk about mechanics. Mechanics are understanding the relevant gameplay elements and restrictions while planning out and updating a level. And the first tenet I want to talk about in regards to this is don't be afraid to try new ideas. This is most relevant with the LTMs I made for Paladins. Once again, these were temporary modes that were cycled in and out of the game that added some like fun stuff that isn't conventionally known in the game. Fog of War was a really fun one. This started as an idea that our UI designer mentioned on a Discord call while we were working. She was like, hey, what if the game was Silent Hill? And we were playing on a team deathmatch map, and there was like extreme fog around us, and we had such low visibility. And I was like, hey, exponential height fog in Unreal is a thing. Let me see if it works. And it did. I slapped in some fog into our existing maps just for funsies, and it ended up like playing pretty well. We did some playtests, we adjusted the fog where necessary, and I ended up adding in programming some jump scares as a little Easter egg for the players if they run into certain locations. It was a very Halloween themed LTM. But yeah, that's basically developer had idea. I was like, hey, this is a cool idea. It sounds very feasible. It's not complex at all. And we ended up getting it into the game during a patch, and it's currently cycled in and out. Second major LTM was Subway. This particular LTM was inspired by my experience with MARTA and public transit, which I was just talking with some folks about before this presentation. I'm a big public transit nerd. I take MARTA all the time, and I love Five Point Station. It's very organized in what you have to do there. The topmost floor has like the entrance and exits. The second floor has the trains that run west and eastbound, and the third floor, that's not the right way to phrase it. You get what I mean. The lowest floor has the north and southbound trains. I was like, what if I made the map that had like a somewhat similar structure and also had moving trains? So with Subway, first and foremost, I wanted to see if I could implement moving trains into the game. So with a bit of blueprinting, we were able to get them working. It took a lot of polish after some playtesting with QA and the team. But eventually we got to the point where we felt it was ready to get it into a patch, and we did. And the map is currently cycled in and out as an LTM into the game to this very day. So these LTMs were ideas that people or I had like on a whim that I felt I could feasibly make, and we just ended up putting it in after a good bit of testing. So don't be afraid to try new ideas. Second major tenet, have a good understanding of the essential systems necessary to build a level. This is most relevant in Uncharted Rifts. Once again, this was the roguelike component for Wrath 2, entirely separate from the hubs. So by the time I started working on Uncharted Rifts, I had already tackled a decent amount of traps and enemies in Muspelheim, but I didn't have a good understanding of the wide breadth of traps and enemies available. So before diving in and working on the levels for this, I had to make some custom levels on the side just to understand what all our traps could do, because these gameplay scenarios we had to mix and match like a myriad amount of traps and enemies and layouts were relevant. And yeah, the roguelike mode itself was structured pretty uniquely. The player has to traverse a number of gameplay scenarios on a floor to move to the next floor, and each floor had their own randomly generated biome and gameplay scenarios. And designing this was very interesting, actually. How it worked is a designer would make a module, which is this very wide blockout that either followed an L or I format. I means that the entrance and exit are parallel to another. L means the entrance is on one end and the exit is 90 degrees in any direction. And the designer had to block out what wide blockout they could between the entrance and exit. So that's a module. And other designers would go into these modules and add in new gameplay scenarios as sublevels. As you can see from the image on the right, the top is a module a designer made, and the bottom three are different gameplay scenarios that other designers made on top of that module. Right. This allowed us to reuse art assets and not spend so much time making unique, like, overarching levels for every single gameplay scenario, but it also allowed designers to think about like what their own interpretation of another designer's vision would be. It's like one designer makes a soup that has a broth, and then the other designers slap different ingredients into the soup. One designer puts in carrots, another designer puts in beef, another designer puts in candy corn, right? And we had an entire spreadsheet keeping track of designers who worked on the module and designers who worked on the following gameplay scenarios of that module to make sure we could coordinate with folks where relevant. Yeah, next major point, let's move on to aesthetics. This would be gathering references for the level desired and coordinating with artists to figure out what works best. My first major tenet for this, keep artists in the loop actively so they can understand how to best art your setups and come up with unique ideas. This was most relevant in Dawnforge. Once again, this was the map I developed from scratch all the way to publishing and post-launch support and Paladins. This is the siege mode where teams would try and push a cart to the other team's side. And to start on development like this, to start on this map's development, I was handed the concept art you see on the top right with this giant orb and two pillars. And I was also handed like a good variety of references to try and discern how I could put the level together using using these different structures that Art wanted to try and put across the map. Mainly, I needed to try and figure out what points of interest I wanted to lay across the map. Points of interest are these major structures in the map that can be seen ideally from any given direction and help orient the player. There is a bit of wiggle room in that definition, but you get what I mean. Just major structures. Initially, the big points of interest were just the forge building, which the player could see high up from the spawn and at nearly any location of the map, and the orb, right? These were the two things that the player moved around. But we had another point of interest come up as a result of discussions with artists. So the forge. The forge was this big two-floored building in the center of the map near the capture point. And I was talking with artists about how the player had to traverse a lot to actually move between the two floors. And one meeting, as an aside, one of our environment artists said, "What if there was something that moved between the two floors of the forge instead of them just being two different floors with their own layout? And what if there was a hole in the center of the forge that actually allowed the player to move up and down it as if it's an elevator?" And I was like, "That's not a bad idea. What fits in a forge? A hammer." So I prototyped a hammer that moves up and down between the two floors of the forge, and I added a big hole into the forge that allows the player to move between them. Initially, the hammer moved really fast, so the player kind of had to time their jumps on it. You don't see the very fast version of the hammer here. You currently only see the slow versions when the one on the left was already slightly iterated on. But regardless, yeah, the player was able to jump on the hammer and move up to the second floor. The version of the left doesn't have ramps on the lower floor that allows them to actually get onto it from the lower floor and move up to the second floor. They have to do some parkour or stay on it once they move onto it from the second floor to stay on there. And also the anvil moved with it, just as like a tiny little flourish. But the version on the right has ramps to the side of the hammer that allows the player to move up onto the hammer itself and move between the two floors. And it also received a very generous FX and art treatment from the art teams. It has a little soldier that disappears and reappears as the hammer slams down and rises up, and I just think that's pretty neat. But yeah, that idea started off of an aside from an artist, and I was like, you know what, that sounds like a cool idea, and I wouldn't have been able to iterate or like start on that idea if I weren't holding those fairly active meetings with the artists themselves. Second major tenet for aesthetics: if relevant, use art in existing levels to help define your blockouts, and there's a bit of wiggle room in this. But this was the case with Muspelheim. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Muspelheim, I was handed partially done. The main paths of the hub were finished, and I needed to work out how I would add in all the side content and traversal setups and collectibles, right? I could have used preset design tiles, but since a lot of the art surrounding the main path had already been implemented, I found that it was best to use some of the existing art with some block mesh, with some blockout materials on them to make sure it would flow a bit better. Just because developing a level from scratch using design tiles and actively coordinating with art is like a bit different than being handed a level that is already partially done with most of the art already accounted for. So I tried my best to fit my layouts to the art assets that art already had, just to make it easier on them. Plus, we kind of had limited time working on the game at this point. But yeah, this helped me quickly lay out levels in a way that matched the aesthetic that was already defined by artists, so we didn't have to trouble with a lot of mystery when it comes to developing these. We kind of had to work fast at this point. Next major wow, I can't speak English today. Next major level design fundamental: pacing. This is ensuring interactions are balanced and well-timed while planning a level and during implementation. My first major tenet for this: start with simple beats in gameplay, then iterate from there. Don't start with something that's too complex. This is a lesson I learned while working on Uncharted Rifts and Muspelheim, more specifically Uncharted Rifts gameplay scenarios and Muspelheim traversal setups. At the beginning, for both of these, since the Duat biome was post-launch content that the player could unlock after they had beat the main game, and Muspelheim is a hub they could unlock in the second half of the game, I thought to myself, I need to make my setup super complex just because the player needs to be challenged by this point in the game, right? So I used like a big mess of spikes, ropes, and grapples to try and engage the player early, since they had to have a high degree of difficulty, right? Turns out I was wrong, and it turns out the best way I could have designed setups around this were to lay down very simple setups, test, and then figure out how to make them more complex from there. And even then, it turned out that the gameplay scenarios didn't need to be that difficult just because of the ramping nature of the roguelike mode. And even the Muspelheim setups didn't need to be that difficult because they were really in there to test the mechanics surrounding a new follower who spits blue goo to get rid of green goo. But that's an aside. But generally, focus on simple beats, then iterate from there to understand how you can make them more complex. A really good bearing that my lead gave me was focus on 1 to 2 traps or 1 to 2 key elements per gameplay scenario to see how you can make more sensible setups. So in the gameplay scenario you see on the top right, which is one I blocked out fairly early, I focus on a moving rope, some swinging axes, and some spikes. I iterated on this a bit to make the path more feasible later on. But yeah. Here's a quick example of a Muspelheim traversal setup I made early in development and later in development. Hopefully this video will play. Yes, it will. Whoop, I accidentally hit a button. Here we go. First half of this video shows it in its blockout form. Basically, this traversal setup, I should probably explain. The player has to navigate a lot of traversal elements like wall climbs and wall runs to get to the end of the traversal setup and unlock something important. In the case of Muspelheim, it was either unlocking relic chests for them to collect relics from, which were these powerful items that the player could equip on their character, and then their weapon was like supercharged. Or they could unlock a new area to explore, which in Muspelheim, I believe the only case that was applicable were monster dens, which are just a new area for the player to explore and unlock even more chests. But basically, player hits a timer switch. They move up this wall climb, then they move up this quick hurdle to grab this chest. This is where things get a bit tricky. The player comes to this end. They see a wall run. They see a relic chest on the end that they definitely want to open. They see a platform on the other end that they can grapple to. To get to the other end, they have to hit this timer switch. Then they have to hit another timer switch, and then they have to hit a button. But if the first timer switch runs out, everything drops down, so they have to time their shots a bit. I quickly received feedback from QA and design that their reflexes had to be a bit too quick for this, and even as I slowed down the timing, it seemed a bit too complex. It didn't seem to be as on par with some other setups we had in the map. Let me rewind a bit just to discuss that moment that was there. There's a small tidbit. Nope, that's the second half of the video. On this platform, the player needs to use Pocket, which is our other follower that allows the player to glide to other platforms. They have to use Pocket to get on the Spirit Spring, and they have to shoot an arrow at a timer switch in the distance to lower gates and enter the monster den. This was also seen as too complex. And then in the second half of the video, this is how it currently is in the final game. Everything in the first half is the same. Hit the timer switch, hit the switch, climb up this little wall element, move up this vault, open this chest. This little climb down rope for the player to activate was added just so the player could get here as like a semi checkpoint if they're moving on a mount. This area was overhauled significantly. Player hits a timer switch, 2 platforms rise up out of the ground, and they move onto the wall run to get the relic chest. Infinitely easier and more on par with the setups we had. Could I have made that more complex? Yeah, but it was simple to start and it got the job done. Then I summon Pocket. I go over to the other end, and I ended up removing the setup involving the spikes in front of the monster den entirely. And the player simply gets on the platform and they can enter the monster den from there. Cool. This is not F11. There we go. Yellow. There we go. Second major tenet for pacing: look to prior successful levels for reference or use them as a basis to create new levels. This was especially the case for Cosmic Events, which was the live service component of the game. Here I was creating new anomalies out of old anomalies or placing new items across hubs, and I'm going to talk specifically about creating new out of old. How Cosmic Events work is you have a subset of objectives you need to complete within a certain amount of time. It's like a battle pass, and once you complete those objectives, you unlock new tiers and get rewards. And um, these anomalies were different levels that spawned in the world for the player to tackle unique combat or unique setups. And some of the cosmic events dictated that certain enemies spawn in the level, or there needs to be a certain setup in the level. And so, in the instance you see on the right, I was given a task to create a level with ghost scorpions across the anomaly, and the player had to slay an X number of ghost scorpions total after encountering a number of these anomalies to actually clear that objective. I very well could have made a brand new level with ghost scorpions, but instead what I ended up doing to save some time was I duplicated an older level that already had several unit spawners intact, and I simply swapped them out for ghost scorpions with objective tracking embedded in. So the player is then able to slay the ghost scorpions, accomplish the objective, and you're done. I tested it a bit, and I found that the pacing with this duplicated level matched what I wanted, and it was okay to the other designers, so we were able to go with that. And yeah, to recap, level design, or at least my definition for level design, is building a space for the player to navigate using modular tools and primitives while taking mechanics, aesthetics, and pacing into account, alongside encouraging collaboration with relevant developers. Q&A. I know that was a fairly short presentation, but I figured that gives a wide breadth of the theory I tend to cover when it comes to level design. What questions do folks have? I have answers. If it helps, I can also share the link to this slide deck. I got permission to do so. If folks need a recap to any prior slides, they can come up with questions as well. I'll just read through the Terminus chat. Let me go ahead and share this slide. Oh, the stream is going to be paused when I'm off of that screen, isn't it? See, I only have one monitor. Let me try doing this. The stream's going to be a bit smaller, but this way I can view the presentation and Discord simultaneously. Sean asks, you mentioned reusing assets to make some of the environments. In your experience, how much of a map is prefab versus using custom or specific geometry to that environment? As a follow-up, what additional work is done to help prefabbed environments still feel unique? I think that varies depending on how early in development you're in. If it's like pretty early in development, you would expect there to be like a good layer of experimentation with tentative assets or assets that haven't been developed by a team. So like to that end, you don't really have a whole lot you're experimenting with. But later in development, as was my case with Muspelheim, a lot of the game was already, the foundations of the game were already baked in. We already had a good idea of what prefabbed assets we could use. We already had a good idea of what BPs we could use for a lot of circumstances. Just reading that question carefully to make sure I understand it. How much of a map is prefab versus using custom or specific geometry to that environment? Okay, I think I see what you mean now. When it comes to prefabbed, that depends on the restrictions of the map itself. Uncharted Rifts had simplistic design tiles just because we knew a lot of what we were designing for, and it didn't have like a whole lot of edge cases. Whereas Muspelheim had to have like a lot of custom or specific geometry to that environment because there was a lot that the player could explore in comparison. Though there was a foundation for like the areas that the player couldn't go or where they could go, the artist had to fill in a lot of blanks. So TLDR, it depends on the mode, and it depends on how early in development you are. In my case, Uncharted Rifts, simple mode, very geometric setups. We only really needed design tiles and some simple BPs. But in the case of hubs, there was a lot of room that the artist had to fill, so there was a lot of room for custom geometry. Then as a follow-up, what additional work is done to help prefab environments still feel unique? Modularity, just planning out what areas of the level are going to accomplish what, and what areas of the level are blockers or serve as like hard invisible walls or hard areas that the player can't go compared to others. Um, in designing hubs in Uncharted Rifts, we just delineate these with simple design tiles for where the player can't go, and the player basically fills in, or the artist basically fill in the gap, and that's how it works. Hopefully that answers your question. Kylie LG asks, "What is your process for coming up with level blockout prior to going in engine?" This also depends on the mode. If it is a wider hub, if it is a larger map, I find that I have to do a lot of planning. I like using Figma design to go in and make a quick top-down layout for where the player is going to go. And the main path they're actually going to take. Um, and then I use gradients to delineate what floors the player is going to be on. So yeah, I spend some time working on a top-down just to get like a very high-level idea of where the player is going to go, and then thereafter I go right in engine and block out the space just to see where the player is going to move and actually start testing it out. In terms of mechanics, we have to take into account ahead of time. We have to. Oh, I had a point there. Yeah, so we have to take into account the main path and the main objectives that the player needs to use. So in Figma, I'll often delineate certain objectives that the player needs to accomplish at certain locations. I'll delineate the main path they have to take to get to said locations, and maybe I'll even go super high level and say, this is going to be where a medium combat setup is. This is going to be where a light traversal setup is. Stuff like that, right? And then I block it out with some highly tentative assets and then iterate from there depending on the state the game is in. So TLDR, top-down layout in Figma, taking into account the mechanics of the level you're making. Block out in Engine with modular design tiles and a very high-level assets surrounding combat and traversal, and then constant iteration based on how the game and or level ends up developing, or the ideas you come up with in collaborating with art. Next question by Dansai. I'm just curious, but do level design and environment art roles work hand in hand with each other? Absolutely. In pretty much every single project I mentioned in here, I was communicating with environment artists fairly actively just to make sure things were getting done, and the vision was pretty consistent. I found that with each project, I'm a big social butterfly. When I learn about the artists I'm talking with, I immediately schedule like a weekly meeting just to chat with them about like any questions or concerns we have about the level and see if there are any ideas they have about it. This is kind of what I was mentioning when it comes to the aesthetic slide. Keep artists in the loop actively. And yeah, your artists are your friend. Just make sure they're updated on any imperative changes you're making to the level. And if there are any ideas that would be relevant to the level that you're currently working on, feel free to hear them out. Midnight Miranda asks, what kind of projects and skills are studios looking for when hiring level designers? A good there's a bit that goes into this question, so I'm just trying to a good understanding of flow and pacing, making sure you can make a level that actually that fits the genre of the games that company makes, and just trying to figure out a better way to phrase this. Flow and pacing, making sure you know the tool set that company wants, making sure there are any edge cases outside of flow and pacing that they would want. In my experience as a college student, I referenced a lot of applications from Naughty Dog, Blizzard, and Treyarch to actually develop my ArtStation pieces. And I found that I had to focus on keeping the level as similar to the kinds of levels from games that would make as possible. When I say flow and pacing, I'm referring to making sure that like the major beats of a level are succinct and align with the kinds of games that specific studio makes. So you have a comm room You have combat. Maybe you have some like block out elements here and there to delineate the two, and then you have like another comm area, stuff like that. And the blockout process varies per studio. Here at Sanzaru, it's fairly simplistic. We use design tiles to block things out very fast, and then artists come in. For other studios, it very well could be the blockout is going to do a lot of work in defining what the art is going to be. You could be placing a lot of assets willy-nilly to delineate that. Everyone has a different process when it comes to that. So just be aware of that. Oh, communication, obviously. I think a good bulk of what I discussed in this presentation could answer your question as well. Communication is a very, very big point. Make sure you can talk with people about ideas. Make sure you can filter feedback along the lines of what you're trying to accomplish with your map. And make sure you can talk pretty actively with your stakeholders so something develops well, right? So the TLDR, to your question, Midnight Miranda, is pacing and flow comparable to the game that a studio makes. What was I talking about? There was pacing and flow. There was communication. That's a big one. And then toolset. Toolset is gonna be all over the place. One studio may use Maya, another may use a plugin in Unity to develop things. Lef Floyd, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asks, what common challenges do you face as a level designer, and how do you overcome them? Ooh, this definitely varies by studio and by project. In the case of high res, it was a lot of technical limitations. I was working on a dated engine by that point. I was working in UE3, and we just because of how Paladin's gameplay system operated, I couldn't quite do a lot of the things I wanted to in a blockout form. There were a lot of weird scale and blueprint restrictions I had to take into account when it came to some of our interactable elements that and I needed to make sure I wasn't stretching them too far. I say as I made a map with moving trains. So in the case of high-res and paladins, it was technical restrictions due to a dated engine and how the gameplay system was developed by that point. Here, I'm trying to see if this is something I can discuss. I think in some respects with the studios I worked on, I think there could have been a better job at communication or like making sure we're keeping on top of one another when a major element of a map is modified. This could vary from like, hey, this imperative POI in a map needs to change based on feedback from an art director, to okay, this fundamental gameplay system is being overhauled a bit, and we have to adjust our traversal setups to a lot of other things, right? I wish I was updated more and stuff like that, and I wish I kept on top of stuff like that more, right? So I try my best to have open communication, but sometimes some things get left in the weeds, you know. So yeah, communication. And in terms of how I'd overcome instances like that, that would simply be a case of me making sure that there is an open communication forum where folks can talk about issues that arise. I try my best to do this. I'm doing this a lot now. Like when I get onto a new project, I make sure to like make a new central chat with all the folks who are going to be involved in said project, so I can talk with them as much as possible about any concerns that pop up. Stuff like that, you know. Midnight Miranda asks, you mentioned open communication with artists. Are there some things artists can do on their end or things artists have done for you that help the process of developing levels and environments? Absolutely. In Paladins, it was artists offering feedback on the blockout I gave just to see if it would fit within the kinds of assets they wanted to develop for the level. And in also in some occasions it would be artists playing through the level itself and offering some gameplay related feedback, and also taking into accordance the scale of the assets they would have to slap into the map itself. That's basically this slide. That's how the hammer POI came about. That's how some of the elements that were put into the map came about, right? So basically just suggesting feedback and ideas. And then what you said is very related to the answer I just gave to Love Floyd, which is alerting me when major changes come about, or letting me know if a major change needs to be made, or letting me know, honestly, if there needs to be a pivot in the map itself as early as possible so I can take that into account ahead of time, right? Stuff like that. So, TLDR, open communication, and ideas. Sean, thebomb.com, asks, around how much time do you think you spend in each phase of design on average? Figma, Blockout, and beyond. I feel like I've given this preface for like nearly every question, but it varies depending on the project. I'll give some examples. Can I talk about this? For a hypothetical spoke, of like comparable spies. I have no idea if anyone here has actually played Wrath 2, but if we're talking about a linear section of the game where the player has to traverse an entire temple with some traps to get to, excuse me, I need a cough, to get to an objective or collect an item, I would say designing something like that on Figma takes about 3-4 hours, excluding some feedback iteration. What my process for working on something like that is I make the Figma layout, taking into account the mechanics that need to be laid in and the POIs that need to be laid in. Then I present it to my leads and anyone relevant to the project for feedback, and then I iterate on that. And then yeah, so Figma takes a good bit. Blocking out is where things get a bit more complicated. If we're talking about my first pass on the blockout, that would also be around 3 to 4 hours, because that's really me laying in the foundation of the design that I actually made in Figma or a given top-down program. With iteration intact, though, it takes a while. A long time. Iteration is like near endless on that blockout to make sure it's at a point where we've really nailed all the points, nailed all the major points that the designers and the artists have in mind, and that'll vary depending on the size of the thing you're designing. Figma blockout. When it comes to getting the level arted and actually working with them to make sure that the blockout is modified to accompany the art, that takes, if we're keeping in mind this applies to a linear section in Wrath 2, that takes like some weeks. That certainly takes some weeks, because the art process is pretty extensive. I don't think I provided a time estimate for blockout. For the iteration part of blockout, the iteration part of blockout would also be some weeks. just because the iteration of blockout and art, that just takes up a good bulk of the project, and even then there may be some edge cases we have to account for. And then basically after that, after we've laid down the foundation of the level, we make some small changes here and there to make sure it's good for the game when it releases. Kylie LG asks, between graduation and your first time in the industry, what were the skills you focused on, and how did you go about developing those skills? Do any of these practices continue in your current career? So for me, there was virtually no in between graduation and first time in the industry. I entered the industry immediately after I graduated, but I will answer this from the perspective of what I did in college to develop my skills to get into the industry. And I think this is actually a really good question to answer. So virtually everything I learned to get into the industry was outside of my classes. I knew very early on in my career, 2019, that was my sophomore year, I knew very early on that I wanted to work on level design specifically. Because by then I had already done like a good chunk of game jams in my university's game development club, and I knew precisely what I wanted to specialize in. So I did a lot of research on what I wanted to do. I did a lot of research on what level design encompassed and the kinds of jobs I wanted to have. So I worked on my portfolio projects and any indie games with that perspective in mind. In terms of what those skills were specifically, I would constantly look up job positions that I wanted to have and make sure I'm learning the things that said job position has. Not quite literally everything, but like some very general stuff that would pop up in these job positions. For instance, I noticed numerous job positions had Unreal as a skill that was mentioned. It mentioned good blockout skills. They would mention good communication skills, so I made sure I was working on those pretty actively. Um, and I made sure I was taking a good bit of time to work on the tool set. So I mentioned Unreal. Unreal was a big intersection. It was a big intersection in the job positions I was noticing. So I spent like a lot of time working on personal portfolio projects that were in Unreal specifically. In fact, I'm pretty sure I can pop open my portfolio right here if you can still see my screen. So these four tiles here actually are all college stuff. This one on the left is Dawn Forge. I haven't published any work from Wrath 2 on my portfolio yet. But for instance, I would work on a level for a zombie survival shooter that I was making with some friends. I would work on a replica Apex Legends map that I would get feedback on from friends and see if I could develop it as close to Apex Legends as possible. I would work on a Last of Us map in Maya, stuff like that. Um, cool. So TLDR response. I knew what I wanted to do very early on in college, which helped me uh, understand what I needed to train in order to get into the industry. And said skills that I needed to train were communication. I didn't really talk about that a lot, but I basically became a social butterfly in college and learned to talk with a lot of people to understand how I could talk with folks in the industry, but also just generally have a good social life. That's an aside. Number two, um, tool sets. I learned a lot of Unreal because a lot of job positions mentioned Unreal. Some positions, especially PlayStation, mentioned Maya, which is why I worked on Maya for this one. Um, oh, and connections. Of course, connections. Yeah. I should probably talk about that too. In college, I worked on this game called FPS Boys with some friends, and me and those friends are still friends now. And every single one of those friends currently works in the industry. I was the last one in that group to get into the industry, and I wouldn't have done it if it weren't for some of the feedback I got from these friends. Um, while in college, I made sure to constantly update my resume and portfolio with the work I was developing, and I constantly showed it to my connections on LinkedIn or my friends to make sure they were polished enough, right? So making sure you're open to feedback on stuff like that. Hopefully that answers your question. Midnight Miranda asks, how does concept art weave into the level design process? Are you given concept art and make a level based on that? Or do you block out an idea and concept art is made based on that? Or is done more in tandem? Definitely the former. I have not encountered the latter yet. It is more that I am given concept art and I make a level based on that idea. That was quite literally the case with Dawnforge. That is the case with things I'm working on. Yeah, I'll be passed on art, and projects I work on from there will surround these tentative ideas that the artists have. It may not even necessarily be concept art. It could be an environment art piece that an artist worked on the side, and then the lead said, "Hey, it'd be cool if there was a level that surrounded this." And I was like, "Okay, I can try making a level that surrounds this piece, and anything the artist may make that's relevant to this, right?" Um, yeah, I've rarely. Okay, well, concept art specifically, the former is the case. I'm giving concept art and I make a level based on that. Um, environment art, on the other hand, it's both. Environment art, it can be both. Um, I can. There is totally room for me to block out. I mean, my process for a lot of my maps is I block out a map and art makes environment art around it. So, yeah, cool. That should be all the questions. Did folks have anything else they wanted me to answer?
Seems like that is all the questions. But thank you so much for this presentation. This has really been really insightful.
For sure. This was super fun. Glad to present for y'all.